Alright guys, real quick I'm going to make an updated video on how to trim pretty much every single airplane in War Thunder except for the Spitfire is the only one that I found that it doesn't work on because it doesn't have trim tabs. This includes Bf109s and FW190s. That's what we're going to do today in this one, is we're going to trim this FW190. You can see on the back of the plane here, aileron trim tabs, rudder trim tabs, and of course elevator trim tabs, which we already have access to in-game. But in order to get access to this trim tab and this trim tab, we're going to have to take it to test flight. Before we do, we're going to go up to our controls here. We're going to go down to the trimming section, and we're going to delete this. Trim aircraft, don't use it, just unbind that key. Come down here to Trimmer's Fixation. I like to use Alt and T. You're only going to press it in these occasions when you go to test flight, so it doesn't need to be a readily accessible key. Just whatever you can remember. That's why I use Alt and T, because it's kind of difficult to press, but easy to remember. So elevator trim axis, I have it set to my hat switch, so up and down on my hat, the joystick hat, does my elevator trim axis, but I also set it to my keys as well. It's backwards on the keys, so I have increase value as down, decrease value as up, and I like to hit both keys at the same time in order to reset the axis value. The next most important thing is making sure relative control is on yes. Relative control sensitivity, about 30%. Relative control step, 1%. Is it okay? Aileron trim axis, same deal except I use right control and right to increase, left control and left to decrease. My left and right hat switch does the aileron trim as well, and then resetting the axis value with left and right. Relative control sensitivity on 30% with relative control step on 1% and relative control on yes. So hat on my joystick does not only elevator but also aileron, which is why my rudder trim is actually the left and right instead of my aileron being left and right on the arrow keys. That may seem backwards, but it's easier for me to come up here and use the left and right arrows in the middle of a flight to get to the rudders, because if I'm in the middle of the flight I'm going to be doing my ailerons on the joystick anyway. So increase value for right, decrease value for left on the rudders, resetting with left and right, which will also reset my aileron trims. Relative control sensitivity about 30% with relative control step on 1%. These two settings, don't forget to do them. The relative control step is telling the game how much you want to move your trim in what increments, and we're going to choose 1% increments so that we can have precision. Now once you've done all that, you set up your controls, come over here, pick the aircraft you want to do. It is per aircraft that you make the saves, so every single plane that you want to fly in sim, you're going to want to take in a test flight and do this trim value for. So pick one, right click it, take it to test flight, make sure it says Simulator Battles Difficulty. Make sure that you don't bring in, if you have access to bombs, don't bring them in. Bring in a clean wing fighter, and bring in your fuel amount. Bring in the minimum amount. That's the amount that you're probably going to be fighting with most of the time and cruising with most of the time. So I like to bring in whatever my minimum load is and trim for that weight, because the weight does affect your trim, which is why we're also not going to bring in ordnance. So we've got simulator battle difficulties, minimum loadout of fuel, no bombs, hit OK. And I'm going to reset the trims because this plane does have, you see that it says position has been restored. That's from my last time doing this. We're going to be redoing it for the sake of this video, so I've just reset everything back to 0%. We're going to start up our engine here. And if you see, even though I'm in an FW190, you guys are like, this thing doesn't have trim. Check it out. There's my aileron trim. Of course, I've got elevator trim as per usual, and there's my rudder trim. Two things that we otherwise wouldn't have access to, you do have access to in test flight. The thing is, those trim tabs, they're mechanically locked into position, meaning that ground personnel would put that trim tab into a particular setting for you and then lock it into place. And once it's been selected, it cannot be adjusted from within the cockpit in the middle of a flight. It has to be adjusted again on the ground. And we simulate that in War Thunder by doing it in a test flight mission so that you can come into test flight, you can take off, and you can find the trim values that work for your airplane that you want to set it up for, and then you can save it with Trimmer's Fixation. And Trimmer's Fixation is the act of locking it into place. And then the game will look at your trim values that you have set and saved, and it will load those in every time you spawn in that aircraft. And that's what's going on with that message down here when you spawn in and it says trim values have been restored. And that'll work in the live WarThunder game as well. So if you notice, I've just taken off. If I let go of the stick, my FW190 gets that very familiar FW190 left turning tendency. You guys have all seen it. If you fly with a joystick or you fly with a console controller, an Xbox or a PlayStation or whatever, you've dealt with this before, and it can be very frustrating because you're spending 90% of your time holding the stick slightly off to the right to keep the wings level, and if you let go, you immediately start to roll off to the left, and you can, if you're looking in another direction, you're trying to do something, and you come back, all of a sudden you're disoriented, you can get vertigo really, really quickly. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix that with trim. So what I do in sim battles is I'm 95% of the time I'm cruise climbing. So I like to trim my aircraft for a nice cruise climb. So I set a nice cruise climbing throttle, about 91%, keep the engines a little bit cooler, save a little bit of fuel. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to start clicking in some aileron trim. I'm going to click in some elevator trim and just find a nice setting until those wings don't get very much movement left or right. You're not building a piano here. It doesn't have to be perfect. So I am rolling just ever so slightly, but now you can see my hands are off the stick and the plane is staying level. Then we're going to come in here, we're going to look at our turn coordinator. And you can see this side slip indicator here. We are askew, so our ass end is not quite in line with the bead of the aircraft. You can see this little black ball here is off to the right. This is dead center. This little notch right here is dead center, and we want that ball to be in the center. So the rule of thumb here is always step on the ball. So if I gave just a little bit of right rudder with my right foot right now, you can see I can bring that ball back into the center. But as I do that, I get a little bit of right roll on the wings. So if I look up, you can see my yaw axis and my aileron axis are very symbiotic. Anything I do with the rudder is going to get translated into the rolling axis as well. So, and I don't want to sit here and hold my foot on the rudder pedal the whole time, so how do we fix that? Why, trim. We're going to roll wings level, get the plane nice and steady again, and we're going to look at that ball, and we're going to click the rudder trim to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right, and see that ball slowly returning to center. And now we're going to come up here, and we're going to readjust our aileron trims to cancel out that yaw input. So I had to ease up on my aileron trims just a little bit until now my wings are level again. Right about there. That seems to be pretty good. So my ball's all centered up, my ass end is in line with the beat of the aircraft. I am on a nice steady cruising climb right here. We're positive rate of climb. We're neither accelerating or decelerating. We're maintaining about 240 knots. Looks like I'm ever so slightly leaning off to the left. Let's see what one notch to the right looks like. One notch to the right appears to be pretty steady. So I can't, one notch to the left is a bit of a left roll, one notch to the right is a bit of a right roll, but it's way better than this. This is what I was getting before, and this is what I'm getting now. If I'm nice and level, a bit of a drift, but you're not building a piano here. One thing I want to show you is this trim value only works at this particular speed. Now this is good because it's my climbing, it's my cruise climbing speed, which is what I'm doing 95% of the time. I'm on my way up to the battle, like intended altitude to cruise at, and I'm looking around and I'm doing all this, and it's nice because I can keep my hands off the stick and I don't get disoriented very easily. My plane stays relatively level and continues to climb on its own. Now we're going to save that, Alt and T, and you see my aileron has been saved, rudder has been saved, elevator has been saved. Now let me demonstrate what I mean by the speed. So if we do a little dive here, apply a little bit of power, we're just going to pick up some extra speed here, and then roll wings level one more time. Now at this extra speed, even though I haven't touched my trim at all, and the plane was perfectly centered up before, if I let go, we're going to get that right roll, because that right aileron trim that we put in there is being over effective. It's getting more wind across the wings, and we're getting more deflection out of those ailerons, and that was translating into a right roll. But if you notice, my plane is self-correcting. That's the beauty of trim. Trim fixes your plane for you. So as we climbed with that excessive speed, and as we rolled to the right with that excessive speed, we bled that speed. And now we've returned back to our normal indicated airspeed, and then we slowed down. When we slowed down, we kind of rolled to the left, and now the nose is sinking. As the nose sinks, we're going to pick up speed again. What we're doing right now is we're porpoising. We're doing a little left and a descent, then a little right and a climb. And we keep doing this in smaller and smaller sine waves until eventually the plane finds the equilibrium where, boom, it locks back into that normal trim setting. So this whole process could take, it could take a couple of minutes. But the beauty thing is I'm flying around in relative control without touching anything. That's the power of trim. That's how it works. Trim is your friend. If you're not using trim, you're making your life a lot more difficult than it needs to be. So I hope that helps. I hope that clears up some misconceptions about trim. Again, to dispel any myths, that's an FW190 that I just trimmed. If I bring that into a match right now, those same settings that I just put in there are going to carry over. Now, if we go to the British lineup and we take a look at the Spitfire, this is the only plane that I've found so far that I cannot trim on the aileron axis, and that's because you can see quite clearly there is no trim tab at all on this aileron. So it straight up doesn't have access to it. However, it does have a rudder trim and it has an elevator trim tab. So both of those can be adjusted, but no aileron trim on any of the Spitfire models that I've seen. Well, here's the 2.3 version, same deal. No aileron trim tab, but here you can see quite clearly it's got the rudder trim tab cut out. So you do have access to the rudder. So that is trim in a nutshell. This is the new updated version. Of course, if you have any questions, come see us over on the Wing-a-Ling Dragon Discord, where we will be happy to help as always. Until then, fly safe. Oscar 7.